Okay, after a short break, I'm back. Now we're down to part three, the final part of 17th century Virginia, Cavalier Society. We're going to now deal with Bacon's Rebellion, one series of events starting in 1676. So, by the way, it was a short break for me, but I have no idea how long the break was for you. How could I know? So, we're skipping ahead somewhat here. Just remember that in a general sense, say from the 1630s into the 40s, 50s, 60s, Virginia was becoming increasingly prosperous, was becoming a larger and larger colony, and through those decades, other colonies were popping up to the north and south of it, eventually making up the 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard from north to south. So Virginia by 1676 was a thriving colony uh, and prosperous, but there were still problems. Bacon's rebellion does already give us a clue that there were still some issues. This uprising of largely poor farmers in Virginia, kind of the former indentured servant types, was long in coming and is the first example of class conflict, at least on a fairly large scale in American history. We'll see plenty of others in this class, but this was not completely, but in many ways, a class rebellion. Poor rising up against the rich, the oppressed rising up against the oppressors, from a Marxist kind of perspective. So it's more than that. Certainly, it's more complicated, but we can kind of start with that. So we're skipping ahead then to 1676. I title this rebellion "The Governor and the Rebel," the governor versus the rebel, and that is the leadership of this one side and the other in this conflict on the defending traditional Virginia and its government was the governor himself, a guy named William Berkeley, famous figure in Virginia's history. And the rebel rouser, rebel, rabble, different words, but the guy who led the rebellion against the governor was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon, whom the rebellion is named after. 1676, exactly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. And this event or series of events has long-term influence, not just on Virginia, not just on the southern colonies that are developing around it, but on the colonies as a whole. And as Alan Taylor, who I've quoted in earlier units, former UC Davis professor, now trader at the University of Virginia, I'm kidding, said in 1676, Virginia erupted in rebellion when the frustrated servants and freedmen, meaning former indentured servants, blamed their plight on an insensitive, exploitative, and unqualified class of ruling planters, meaning the big plantation owner gentry type guys. And this did drastically change things in Virginia and the South. Although we just skipped ahead, but now we're going to go back a little bit and provide some context to understand this momentous turning point in Virginia's and early colonial history. Which brings us to this guy, Opechancanough. And if you can't spell his name, neither can I. That's why the screen is a nice little cheat sheet for me here. This is the brother of Powhatan and his successor throughout the whole period when Virginia was sort of just Jamestown and fighting Native Americans, particularly the Powhatans, off and on. The brother was sort of a major force, alongside his brother, who was the chief, mainly as a gifted leader of warriors. But Opechancanough appears to have been all along more concerned than his older brother about the English and the sort of possibility and even some evidence that Jamestown was going to take off in terms of population, meaning the English are going to become too numerous and too powerful, and we need to do something about it. So he apparently wanted aggressive action taken against the English more so than Powhatan himself. Powhatan appears to not have ever tried an all-out assault on Jamestown and the fort there to try to totally wipe the settlement out for a number of possible reasons that our textbook goes into. One, the Native Americans appear to have feared the Christian God. And this goes back to the end of the first unit where we talked about differences in beliefs and values between Native Americans and Europeans. Native Americans, I didn't say this about their religions then, but Native peoples tended not to think that other tribes' gods were illegitimate. Unlike Europeans, Christians, and Muslims and Jews, the Christians especially, who tended to think, well, everybody else is worshiping a false god or gods, and our God is the only real one. Native Americans didn't have that in their value system. They had their own gods, and their enemies, over there had their own gods. But they didn't doubt that the other gods existed. They didn't doubt that they were real. They just thought their gods are on their side. They're helping them, and our gods help us. So we worship our gods. They worship theirs. So since that was the norm for them, when they heard of the attributes of the Christian God, all knowing, all powerful, and of almighty, they had no reason from their past experience to not believe that the God was there. And so and this isn't just in Virginia. This appears to be this was the case sort of all over the place where Europeans come into contact with Native American tribes. Diverse as they were, this is kind of a common response that, oh my God, we can't take on that kind of God. Our gods don't have that kind of all-knowing, all sort of powerful nature. So they may have sort of held back. Powhatan may have held back in this case because of that. Secondly, as our text also says, goes on to say that Powhatan probably saw the English as good allies. They had their own Native American enemies, and even though the English were small in number at first, the guns that they had, the fort that they built, the manufactured goods that they brought over with them that came in shipments again and again and again, those would all be attractive things in an ally. And the manufactured goods themselves are another possible reason that Powhatan did not seek ever to totally wipe out the settlement of Jamestown and the fort. Now he went to war with them plenty of times, killed plenty of English, but again, the idea of just sort of completely obliterating the colony didn't happen for one or more of those three reasons, most likely. But his successor and brother, Opechancanough, was of a different viewpoint. Coming from James Horne's book, Opechancanough was the most powerful of Powhatan's relatives. Like his brother, he was a vigorous and potent leader at the time the English arrived. Perfectly skilled in the art of governing, it was said, he caused all the Indians far and near to dread his name and had them all entirely in his subjection, according to one English source at the time. And this guy, everybody did what he said because he was a gifted leader and apparently intimidating. He commanded the best disciplined warriors in the whole region. So he'd been mostly a military leader under his brother. But once his brother is gone from the scene, and he now is the leader of this paramount chiefdom, collection of dozens of villages, he and his tribal council decided that they indeed needed to totally try to extinguish the whole Virginia colony, the whole Jamestown settlement as the center of it, as the main part of it at this point, which leads us to the Indiana Massacre of 1622 and the long-term consequences, one of which was ongoing Anglo-Indian bitterness from that point forward. So Opechancanough planned a surprise attack, which was a almost complete surprise, and allowed his warriors to kill about half of the colonists, at least those in Jamestown. By this time, there were some other outlying settlements that survived, but about half of the Jamestown colonists were killed on a single day. So a surprise attack, about 350 out of approximately 700. But of course, it was a failure in the sense that the idea was to get rid of the colony as a whole. And all it really did was bring everlasting or long-lasting retribution on the part of the English. So the English, from this point forward, thought anything that they did violently toward Native Americans, at least this group, Native Americans, was justified. Not that they hadn't, been perfectly fine with violence against Native Americans before, but this made them feel more entitled to, avenge this massacre. Another element of the context, taking us back a few decades, is Virginia becoming a royal colony in 1624. Remember, the House of Burgesses was established in 1619 as an elective legislative body, which we usually associate just with governments, but that was created by a private company. But by 1624, the royal government just kind of kept the House of Burgesses and kept its overall structure because it appeared to be working. But the royal counselors or emissaries of the king that came to Virginia, witnessed in part the aftermath of the 1622 massacre. So it's part of the reason that they basically sent a recommendation back to the king, or took one back to the king, leading him to pull the charter of the Virginia Company. Charter meant the Virginia Company was granted a charter in 1607 or 1606 to colonize Virginia. It was a legal grant of authority, so like a legal license to do the colonizing. And the king, by pulling their charter, it means he takes the charter away from them, like rips it up. So he not only took the colony away from them, he did blow up the whole company, sent the Virginia Company into oblivion. Not a company any longer, showing you the power that kings had in those days. He could just dissolve, and did, a lucrative, wealthy company. It'd be like, a president of the United States just deciding that Google doesn't exist any longer. That could never happen today, but in those days it could and did. There was good reason why the king and his government would think that the Virginia Company has bungled this whole settlement, because they had for so long. It is ironic, however, since we know that it's right around this time, just before it, that Virginia mixed, the Virginia Company mixed sort of the right ingredients together. We've just gone through the 5 main ones that turned things around. But it's only 5 years after. Remember, I said it took some time for those changes to really proliferate and become, to be actualized. So at 1624, it didn't really, the fruits of the changes, the tobacco economy, headright system, etc., those hadn't sort of blossomed yet. So they're seeing still the signs of, the old failures. And this is, again, what leads to the English government making Virginia a royal colony. So it at first was a charter colony, meaning named after the license of authority, common word of the name is charter. So there are actually 3 different types of colonies in this English system of 13 colonies that's in the process of, they're being in the process of being created. So a charter colony, we'll see another one of those. Royal colonies, and some, like Virginia, some others go from one to the other. And there's a third type as well that we'll see in time, and that's what's known as a proprietary colony. And the proprietary colony was in some ways like a charter colony, only instead of the government giving a legal license and grant of authority to a company, it gave it to like one dude, one person got a colony. That's correct. Maryland, for instance, was given to a guy named Lord Baltimore, rich, powerful, landowning member of the nobility and the king, and he got Maryland. The city, of course, of Baltimore is named after him to this day. William Penn, later on, becomes the proprietor, given the colony that bears his name, or bore his name, Pennsylvania, now a state in our union as well. So proprietary colonies are the third type of colony. charter colony, royal colony, proprietary colony. Virginia was never a proprietary colony, but it was a charter colony, and now in 1624 it becomes, for the rest of its existence, a royal colony. So in this kind of setup, there's the king, of course, who never leaves England, a royal governor who sometimes doesn't leave England. Sometimes he sends out a lieutenant governor over here, and he stays in England. But sometimes the governors were hands-on, and they always had to share power with the elected colonial assembly. In Virginia's case, it's the House of Burgesses, and they usually had governors of other colonies as well, a colonial council approved by the governor or picked by the governor, who were also usually wealthy landowners. They were just selected to be advisors to the governor, not elected. So both the assembly and the council came from rich guys already living in the colonies, but one was elected, one was appointed. So this is the English government taking greater control of the colony. It was more hands-off when it was a charter colony in the hands of a private company. The population by this time had grown to about 1,200. Again, that's partly because the massacre had only taken place in Jamestown. It didn't affect all of the outlying areas. All adult males could vote under this arrangement now. So all adult males, whether they were rich or poor, could now vote, at least for the colonial assembly, the only part of this tripartite government that was open to, popular election. So the Native American situation and the fact that the government is under royal authority now gives us the context we need to understand Bacon's rebellion and its two main protagonists, William Berkeley, the governor at the time of Bacon's rebellion and before. So you can see here he did 2 stints as governor, 2 rather long ones, and this is partly why he's clearly the most important single person in Virginia's 17th century history. Berkeley was trying to, at least the way it's said by one historian, create a neo-aristocratic society, which meant he was interested in getting a lot of guys like himself, members of the gentry, to come over and to kind of bolster the power of the upper classes, and against sort of the possible encroachments of middle class upstarts and the poor, etc. And he could make this attractive by appealing not to all members of the gentry, but anybody that was a son of a member of the gentry, but not the first son. In England, at least in aristocratic or gentry ranks, the inheritance system that was always used was what's known as primogeniture. Primogeniture means eldest son inherits. Not necessarily all, but almost all. So this was an age-old practice, not just in England, but in a lot of other places too, because if you wanted to make sure the wealth stayed in the family, and wealth was usually land in those days, you had to have the eldest son inherit. Because if you divide everything up between the offspring equally, and then they do that again in the next generation, then you get little tiny pieces of land spread out. So you keep the land in kind of one chunk, primarily by giving almost all of it to the eldest son. But if members of the gentry are powerful, wealthy, important people, then isn't the second and third and fourth son important? Yes, but they're not going to get the gift that their older brother gets, which is the whole estate, the whole mansion, thousands of acres of land, et cetera, et cetera. They're not set up as easily. So what do? Again, Berkeley was I don't know if he was a second son, but he wasn't the first son of a member of the gentry. Well, there are actually limited things for the upper class, both the nobility and this class, the gentry, both upper class, to do in England or Europe. Why? I mean, they had all the, they had more opportunity than anybody else, so why are they limited? It gets back to something we already know about these guys, is that they don't work. The families don't respect work. And so their children are not going to do anything that smacks of work. there's only a few things that are acceptable, and because they're not work, at least in a physical sense, and right, they're worthy of the family's huge reputation and name. So you could go into, if you're the first son, you're just going to become the proprietor of their estate. The family estate is like a business in itself, like a corporation. You own so much land. You have some people renting cottages and farms on your land. So that's a full-time job. It literally is, even though you're not, again, doing the work yourself, other than maybe signing pieces of paper here and there. So the eldest son, that's got his own job taken care of. A second son might go into government service, maybe get a law degree, and Cambridge or Oxford, and then sort of work his way up the civil service. And if he does the family proud, really proud, he'll become a major advisor to the king, maybe the chancellor of the exchequer or the foreign minister, a high-ranking official in the government serving the royal government. Another son might go into the church and become a bishop or archbishop if he does the family proud there. A fourth son, including the eldest, might go into the military. And if he did right by the family, he'd rise through the ranks and become a general and lead the king's troops in battle against foreign foes in England. Okay, what about another son? I'm not saying they all had to do it in that order. Sometimes they might have had multiple people doing this, going into the law, whatever. But the only real other opportunity was, yes, you guessed it, go to the New World, go to the Americas, go to Virginia as the first colony, and make some of yourself there. Why was that okay? Because they saw, the family would see the possibility that you could, again, do the family right by getting a gigantic piece of land there and being a powerhouse figure in this or other colonies. This is part of the reason we have already noted that there was a disproportionately high number of gentry members in the first settlement at Jamestown. So Berkeley comes along, of course, later on in the century through the same motivation, and he sees, this motivated the first group that came over. It motivated me to come over, and now I got to keep selling the idea, so it motivates more of my type because he thought that was the key to success, wealth, power, to have sort of the right type of people there. He saw himself as the right type of people. He was also keenly aware. I don't know how early this quote came in his stints as governor, but he famously talked at one point about, I think it was close to Bacon's Rebellion when he said this, I believe, that 6 parts of 7 of Virginia colonists are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. So he was aware that there were class issues, that the poor were grumbling and discontented, angry, and that's an understatement. The other figure on the other side of this, again, the governor and the rebel that led the rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon, also came from the gentry class, also was a second son or below, and so he basically was taking advantage of the advertising had been, in a sense, recruited indirectly by Berkeley himself. But this guy, who's been portrayed by history books for a long time as sort of a Robin Hood-like figure, because he came from a wealthy gentry background, but he becomes the leader of a class rebellion, leads the poor guys against the rich in the colony. So kind of a Robin Hood type story. At least it seemed like that for a long time. I think more recent scholarship has shown otherwise. Bacon, to me, especially from a book that you see on the screen there, James Rice, just a couple of years ago, this was published, makes the case that Bacon was more of a rogue figure, more of a bad guy than a good guy. He might have been leading a group of people who had a good cause, but he appears to be doing it for the wrong reasons, his own reasons. Rice says in his recent book, his status, wealth, and connections, meaning Nathaniel Bacon, won him a seat on the governor's council. He was only like 30 or 32 or something. And as soon as he got there, he got appointed to the council. And the governor, Berkeley, I don't think he even liked him, but Bacon's father was a mover and shaker in England, and he thought, I better put this guy on my council, or it's going to cause political problems for me, because he's got too many connections. That's how it worked in England. Bacon quickly earned a reputation for his, quote, ominous, pensive melancholy. I've never seen those three words together, but it can't be a compliment. Ominous, pensive melancholy, from one of his colleagues. The young man, it seemed, was, according to another, very ambitious and arrogant. And arrogant he was. He, bottom section here, Bacon had a certain disdain for wealthy Virginians that he encountered once he got there, who had reached their position, as he called it, from vile beginnings, according to Edward Morgan, one of the older great historians on 17th century Virginia. Vile beginnings, what could that possibly mean? Well, vile means like disgusting beginnings. So who was rich that came from disgusting beginnings? He was shocked to find that there were at least some rich plantation owners that had gotten rich by, oh my God, working for it. Ugh, that's vile. That's disgusting, despicable. And so he sort of stuck his nose up in the air and said, "That's not right. That's not right. Right? People should come to wealth the right way, the fair way, the way I did it, Nathaniel Bacon, which is by inheriting it from their father." So he was a total snob, and appears to have been disliked even by fellow snobs. So the traditional historical interpretation of this guy as a hero, Robin Hood-like figure, I think needs to be looked at again. It's possible that he led a rebellion that was necessary and fruitful and productive, but did so for the wrong reasons. But I think it's pretty clear that he did so for the wrong reasons. He doesn't appear to have done this, led a rebellion of the poor against the rich, because he cared about the poor. And he cared about himself, it appears. It looks like he was making a power play to try to become the leader of Virginia as a colony itself. The whole thing started, believe it or not, over a hog, pig. I'm not kidding. It was one hog or two. But Native Americans in one part of the colony, a little bit further away from Jamestown by this time, different county, Native Americans had loaned a planter, a white plantation owner, not a super rich guy, not a super poor guy, kind of in the middle, but they loaned him something, loaned him money, and he kept deferring paying them back, and he was behind, and so they finally got impatient, or got upset about it, and they snuck onto his land and stole. It was a hog or two hogs, I forget, but he caught them in the process, or saw them, and he and some of his friends, relatives, sons, I forget, started sort of this chase after this small group of Native Americans tried to get their hogs back. And it was over a number of days through the countryside in Virginia, in the wilderness, and they eventually came to a cabin, kind of like a abandoned cabin, but they could tell people were sort of living in it, and they attacked the Indians as they came out, Native Americans that came out of the cabin, and killed them all, only to find out when they approached the bodies that they killed the wrong guys. Those weren't the guys they'd been following for days. It was a group and from a different tribe. And the farmer in question, tobacco farmer in question, must have thought, uh-oh, as soon as he realized who they were, because Governor Berkeley, we just met, had for a number of years now been pursuing a policy of peaceful negotiations and peaceful trade relations with Native Americans. And he hadn't achieved that with all of the tribes in Virginia, but he had with some, including this one, the tribe that this guy and his friends had just killed a number of their members. So this wasn't going to go well with Governor Berkeley, he must have seen, because it's getting in the way of his successful trade relationships with Native Americans. And Berkeley, I don't think, had real moral reasons for peaceful relations with Americans. It was more that he believed it was practical. It would help the colony economically. It would, it's better for the colony to not be at war all the time. It's expensive, it's dangerous, etc. But it was, I think, a workable policy, and this was getting in the way of it. So right away, Bacon, who was already apparently becoming popular amongst the former indentured servants who owned land sort of inland from where most of the big plantations were, whether he was soliciting a leadership role or they kind of went to him is not entirely clear. But whereas the governor, when he heard about this, said, look, we have to be careful, okay? We ought not to involve the innocent with the guilty. So he's saying if one group of Native Americans stole a hog or two, and then they got into a fracas with some of our guys, okay, it's possible we might have to go to war with that group. But let's carefully distinguish who we're talking about here, because these are different tribes. But Bacon made a statement saying, we will have war with all Indians, all. So Bacon is saying, and he's saying this in part because it's what the small poor farmers, former indentured servants, were basically saying themselves. We don't care which Native Americans are responsible for this sort of whole incident being started. We're going to use this as an opportunity to go to war with all Native Americans. So this is kind of painting all Native Americans with one brush. So we could see this as racism and prejudice, as it certainly was in part, a big part of it. But this also has to do with the long-term grievances of the poor farmers that Bacon is quickly becoming sort of the lightning rod for. This somewhat overcomplicated map I should replace, but I kind of like it anyway. But the only part of it you need to remember are the first two words at the top, other than the and. Tidewater region, which you can see on the right side of the map, coastal plain in parentheses Tidewater, and the Piedmont region, which is two boxes over, kind of in the middle, Piedmont, land at the foot of mountains, Piedmont. So think of it this way. The Tidewater region is the area closest to Chesapeake Bay, closest to the ocean, where Jamestown and the regional settlements were, but it's where most of the more fertile land is, at least for growing tobacco. So tobacco plantations, most of the big land, big pieces of land were owned there. The Piedmont has less fertile soil, especially for growing tobacco. Not that you can't grow it there, but it's not as profitable. The quality of the crop isn't as good. Sometimes the crop doesn't work at all because you're getting up into foothills and more rocky soil and foothills. The fertile soil is sort of down in the plains, well-watered areas of the rivers, sort of emptying into the Chesapeake Bay. So, and this is where indentured servants increasingly have their land. Those that had done their indenture now get their freedom dues. Why? Because all the land had been taken up in the Tidewater area, at least by the 1660s, 1670s, when we're approaching Bacon's Rebellion. So if you were one of those poor guys that signed an indenture contract in the 17th century, if we divided, say, the time between the founding of Jamestown, 1607, and Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, into three parts. I don't know what the number is there, but sort of the first third in those years, in that span of time, middle third, later third. Which third would be the best to come in? If you didn't know what was going to happen and you were just sort of guessing, right, you'd want to come not in the first, right, not in the third. You want to come in the second phase. Not that you would have known this, again, in England, but if you had any knowledge at all, why wouldn't you come in the first phase? Well, I can dispatch with that one quickly. Eating dead people. How does that sound? No, not so good. It was a disaster in the first years. We just learned this. So you wouldn't want to come then. Well, why wouldn't you want to have come in the latter third, in the years just before Bacon's Rebellion? That's because all the land to be taken up except the Piedmont land out here in the middle of this map. If you came in the 1630s, 1640s, in the middle period, you'd be already past the the time of troubles, the disastrous period of starvation, all that. The colony would be profitable, and there was some land left in the tidewater area. However small your piece of land, your freedom dues would be on fertile soil, most likely. So if you came in the middle period, that's when you'd be sort of best suited to succeed and get what you wanted, get ahead. But so what's starting to happen by the 1660s and 70s is there's more and more former indentured servants now out in the Piedmont area with their own farms, but they're lousy farms because the soil is poor. And of course, they weren't told this when they signed the contract and wasted 5 years of their lives working for some, schmuck, that kicked them around as an indentured servant, only to find out that their freedom dues is land that they can't even sort of do anything with or do much with. And so this is a powder keg waiting to explode. This is not only a group of angry farmers; it's a growing group because more indenture contracts are coming, due each year, and more freedom dues being paid off, and there's nowhere to put them but out here. And so this is a dangerous, dangerous situation indeed. So the farmers living out in the Piedmont are increasingly angry because they felt like they were lied to, angry because they'd been petitioning the government for years to lower their taxes and to make these reforms that made their lives easier, and the governors and the House of Burgesses continued to ignore them, including Governor Berkeley. We saw Berkeley was aware of the class anger in that quote that I just showed you, but he tended not to do anything about this. And so the farmers are angry. They're being ignored. We're suffering or struggling through no fault of our own. It appears that was partially true anyway. And the government won't sort of take up their grievances. Making it all worse from the Piedmont farmer, former indentured servant's perspective, one of the main changes that they wanted, or things for the government to do, send out the Virginia militia armed force and fight Native Americans, get them out of the way. Because guess what? Where the Native Americans by this time had been basically driven out of the Tidewater area. Where do you think they were now? Basically in the Piedmont area. So the indentured servants, former servants, now have lousy land, and they're also in dangerous territory because Native Americans are still under the impression that that's their land for some strange reason, like they've been living there for thousands of years, and so they think it's theirs. So this is partly why you saw Bacon saying we'll have war with all Indians, because he's a mouthpiece for these enraged farmers who don't care about Native Americans at all. They just want them out of their way. So they're angry that Berkeley is pursuing this policy of peace and trade relations with Native Americans instead of going to war with them. And so this is why Berkeley ignores their constant demands to bring out a military force and just wipe out the Native Americans. He just says, no, that's not what we're going to do. So one of the problems with studying this event is that it's hard to find a good guy to like, except for the Native Americans. I mean, among the English. So like even the class part of this, poor versus rich, it's when you first start reading about this, learning about it, listening to this lecture, say, it might sound like, well, I'm in favor of the poor guys. They're getting kicked around. Okay, and in some ways that was true, but on the other side, what do they want to have happen? They want to have the Native Americans completely obliterated, exterminated. So they don't come across looking so good, at least by our standards today, either. So at least on the English side of this, there really isn't sort of a good guy to go around. Bacon, I tried to disabuse you of the notion already that he's sort of the Robin Hood good guy type character. So the former indentured servants out in the Piedmont already received their freedom dues, increasingly disillusioned and disgruntled, are a mounting sort of problem. And sure enough, Bacon eventually, as a member of the governor's council, right, he has direct access to the governor, and he starts making demands. And among those demands is a military force to come out, to be sent out, as this wasn't a new demand, we've already seen, but to wipe out Native Americans. And when the governor doesn't do it yet again. Things kind of come to a head. Bacon decides and says, okay, if you don't, then I'll get my own military force. I'll get my guys. I'll go home, live out in the Piedmont area and get their guns, and we'll fight Native Americans as a unorganized or a partially organized military force. Do you think these guys, any of them, had guns? Of course, they all had guns. This is a frontier area. Nobody goes to a frontier area without a gun. So they all had guns. So, but of course, not only the governor, but all of the rich guys in the House of Burgesses and big plantation owners in the Tidewater region are frightened by this and are, apprehensive about it, of course, because a group of, a large group of armed poor guys who we know already hate us and are angry at us are going out and fighting the Native Americans in the other direction. But what's to stop them from turning their guns eventually in our direction and come marching at us and shooting at us? The answer, nothing. And that's, of course, exactly what happens. Bacon, at one point, and you see this picture here, or the melodramatic picture, but Bacon marches his guys into Jamestown, and in front of with the governor there, has the governor and other politicians, other leaders at gunpoint, and he wanted a commission, meaning he wanted the governor Berkeley to write him an order giving him command of a military force to go out and fight Native Americans. And he said at one point, apparently, I came for a commission, and a commission I shall have. And his men actually cocked their guns and took aim. They're pointing the guns at the governor of the colony. Let me remind you, the governor is the direct appointee of the King of England. So by cocking their weapons and pointing guns at him, right? What have they just done? What has Bacon just done? He's committed treason against the King of England and the English, government already. You don't aim a gun at a governor of the king. But Bacon now started to use his military, mights with this large number of farmers behind him that are armed to intimidate the colony. So that the government did give him a commission, though it was meaningless because it was done under duress. So it wasn't, of course, it wasn't legal. He also got he and his associates elected to the House of Burgesses in kind of a strong-armed election. Although the governor himself, William Berkeley, called the election, mistakenly believing that he was going to strengthen his hand politically by getting more allies in the Burgesses than he had before. And he had enough already anyway, but he thought for sure I'll strengthen it because everyone's going to be terrified at what Bacon is doing and sort of vote for more of our side. And Bacon intervened and intimidated the whole colony and got the opposite results. So now you had a majority of the Burgesses in favor of Bacon and the poor former indentured servants. So they actually passed some reform laws because of this, which may have actually helped the poor farmers for the first time. Bacon's methods here, right? His methods of intimidation also forced average people across Virginia to sign a loyalty pledge under duress. So this has, in some ways, something kind of close to totalitarian, elements to it. Bacon's laws, June 1676. These are the reforms that Bacon and his supporters were able to push through after the election because they had sort of intimidated their way into getting enough seats in the legislature to do this in the Burgesses. Tax reform, reform of corruption in government, etc., etc. The Declaration of the People of Virginia was really a PR statement in a way, but this was to gain and curry favor of the people that maybe were in the middle, average citizens who weren't taking sides or trying not to. This was a document that went around that was telling the people, "Hey, look, we're fighting for what's right and what's good." So in a sense, this was PR in favor of the revolution, supporting Bacon's rebellion. So a civil war breaks out on this because the governor, of course, wasn't going to stand. Again, the king's appointed governor is not going to stand for someone else coming in and hijacking the government and pointing guns at him. So for 3 months, as Professor Rourke says, Bacon's forces fought the Indians, sacked the grandees' plantations, and attacked Jamestown. Berkeley's loyalists retaliated by plundering the homes of Bacon's supporters. James Rice, quoted already, the most recent book on Bacon's rebellion, saying that Bacon had, in his own impulsive way, managed to turn the world of both Virginians and Indians upside down. And this is certainly true. He turned everything upside down. This is quite a drama that's unfolding here in front of us. And Bacon had the audacity to kind of ruin part of the drama by dying fairly early in the Civil War. What? He's like the main player here in this movie. Well, it's not a movie. Real life sort of stepped in, and he didn't die of battlefield wounds. He came down with some sort of fatal illness. The primary source documents say that he had vermin infesting his body or something like that. I don't think I really want to know exactly what that was, but he died of some illness in the middle of this rebellion. But he had a few rich guys on his side, and so he had subordinates that carried on after him. So the rebellion and the violence did continue for some time, even after Bacon was gone, to the point of the rebels advancing on Jamestown, forcing the governor and all the other bigwigs to flee, and they burned it down. Professor Rice saying the fiery glow of Jamestown burning. As these people are sort of watching it, a sign that sort of chaos had ensued. So what was this rebellion really about in the end? And I guess I should tell you what happened in the end. The rebellion did kind of peter out in the end. Berkeley did kind of set up shop on the other side of Chesapeake Bay, outside of Jamestown, and continued to direct military forces and economic forces, which he had the advantage in, to sort of put this rebellion down. So because Berkeley had most of the rich guys on his side, they just had too many resources and outlasted and could control the Chesapeake Bay, the James River, other rivers, because they had more ships and boats available to them. So they just had more resources and weapons, and so the rebels finally collapsed. However, we'll see that the rebels got quite a bit out of it. It's hard to say who won this, clearly. So this is partly poor versus rich, but it was partly, as we've already seen, farmer versus Indians. It's partly rich guys versus rich guys, old money versus new money, in to some degree. It's over power, wealth, rights. So it's confusing. And if you're confused, it's understandable. This is not entirely clear period. This is one of those events in history that shows, I think, quite graphically how murky history actually is oftentimes. It's not always easy or ever easy to put together sort of clearly what happened and why. We can put together the events, but what do we make of them? The interpretation, as I talked about the importance of in the introductory lecture. How are we supposed to interpret this? Well, I'll give it a go. What impact did the rebellion have? A combination of elite rule, popular politics, and racial supremacy. So, and you can argue that both sides won, both sides lost in certain ways. Certainly, two groups that lost for sure, and that's African American slaves and Native Americans. Rich and poor Englishmen had sort of a mixed results, both. So the Virginia government learned valuable lessons, the grandees, rich guys, that changed Virginia going forward. First of all, some of these lessons are quite simple. Some of them get a bit more complicated as we go through. Elites, rich guys, old money and new, realized we got to stick together from now on. We're already outnumbered, by the masses of poor people anyway, by a long shot. If we divide amongst ourselves, it puts us in a bind. So we have to find ways to make sure that we all stay on the same page, at least if there's another sort of class uprising. Uh, Interestingly, the King of England, when he heard about Bacon's rebellion, sent a fairly small force of troops, English regular army troops, under a gentry leader named Sir Herbert Jeffreys. And Jeffreys and his guys got there just as the military part of this was coming to a close. So they got there too late to fight. But Jeffreys took it upon himself to study what had happened and kind of do like a report for his king. And he came to the conclusion in the end that the instigator of this whole thing, the guy to blame for this whole episode of violence, was none other than William Berkeley, the governor of the colony, which was shocking to everybody on both sides. I don't think anybody could have seen this coming. And he actually relieved him of command and sent him back to England in disgrace. And whatever you want to think of Berkeley, and certainly say you could think ill of him, but he had done an honorable job of, and I shouldn't say honorable. He'd done a response. It might not have been honorable. It was a responsible job of governing the colony, meaning he'd handled his duties seriously. He was competent. His policy of peaceful trade relations with Native Americans was probably well advised. In some ways, he certainly wasn't the villain in all this. He wasn't a good guy either. He kind of ignored the plight of poor farmers for a long time. But for somebody from his own class, Sir Herbert Jeffreys, to blame the whole thing on him and send him home was a shock to him and to both sides in this conflict. So the crown, meaning the government, the King of England, had sided with the public by making this decision. By blaming it on the governor, they basically sided with the poor guys. And so the grandees that remained, were horrified by this. And they thought, this can't happen again either. We have to find ways to get the public on our side and turn them against the English crown. Because right at this point, because of what Jeffreys had just done in pointing the finger at the governor and sending him packing, the poor farmers, the average citizens of Virginia, saw the English government as their protectors and saw the rich grandees as the bad guys, their enemies. And they're saying, we have to turn this around. We're going to have to make ourselves look good by making the crown, the English government, look bad. Now, I'm not saying this is the only factor, but you may see where this is going. 100 years later, they'd already achieved that. Because the conflict with Great Britain that leads to the American Revolution is the rich and poor in the colonies basically on the same side, pointing the finger at by that time the British government and seeing them as the villains. And of course, since that happened in all the colonies, it's not just because of Bacon's rebellion, because that only happened here in Virginia. Nonetheless, I do think it made it easier for Virginia as a colony to unify together against Great Britain 100 years later, because the wealthy had already been working at it ever since Bacon's rebellion. Now there's no way we can allow, we have to do some type of propaganda or PR campaign, something to get the public on our side and see the government in England as the bad guys and not the other way around. And they had some more specific and clever ways to do that. Appease the poor farmers. That one's pretty straightforward, not as clever. So we do have to make reforms. Unlike Berkeley, who kept ignoring them, when the poor farmers call for change, we're going to have to give them at least a crumb. More popular participation in government, lighter taxes, and for God's sake, if the Piedmont farmers say we got to fight Indians, we've got to go fight the Indians. We're just going to have to, because this rebellion was worse than fighting the Indians, at least from their perspective. Here's where their response and their efforts to sort of move things or keep things in their favor in Virginia starts to become complex and quite clever. They started to try to get respect and actually sort of to intimidate the average person through signs of their own status. Heretofore, the Virginia planters or grandees didn't live that grandly. Unlike their, say, older brothers back home who were sort of these gigantic mansions and lived very ostentatiously, these guys had big houses, but they were kind of rough. Again, it was a frontier area. But they deliberately started to change that in the years after Bacon's Rebellion, starting to build big mansions based on the styles coming from their own families in England. They started to wear fine clothes ordered from Europe and brought over much more than they had before. They started to focus on education of their children more, sending them to college at Harvard and Yale and University of Virginia. Refined manners. And this is to kind of intimidate. Like, well, how does that intimidate? Doesn't that just infuriate the average person who doesn't have access to all those things? Sometimes it does, sometimes it can. But even in our world today, I would argue that we tend to often be kind of intimidated, or at least look on with awe at sort of the rich when they sort of show it off with big homes and lots of toys, and like, wow, he's got a helicopter, he's got a jet, and they see quite, I think, insightfully that we can culturally hit these people over the head by showing off what we have, what we can do that they can't do or don't have access to anyway, and it'll cow them. It'll keep them in their place, at least as the wealthy saw it. And they did see the poor, indentured servant types as sort of people that needed to be kept in their place. They also quite cleverly learned and practiced what one historian calls the art of condescension. I almost said condensation, but that's not quite the same thing. So what does it mean to be condescending to someone? If you're condescending, it means you're kind of talking down to them, but it means you're doing it in kind of a clever way. You're kind of concealing, making it sort of confusing whether or not you're actually, criticizing the person or being rude to them or not. So you might be saying it, you might be insulting them with a smile on your face. That's sort of condescension. And this makes perfect sense because the grandees, the big gentry type plantation owners, they don't want certainly the poor farmers to think that, they want them to think that they're kind of in league together, that they're on the same side. But they don't want to go so far with it to give the impression, and they're horrified by the possibility they could give the impression that they're on equal status with the poor. Oh, hell no. So we have to kind of find a middle ground where we can let them know, or let them at least believe, that we're on their side and they should be on our side, but not to the point where they think we're going to be like buddy and hang out with them. And so the art of condescension is perfect for this, because you kind of keep them guessing. I think this rich guy actually, thinks highly of me. I'm his neighbor. He never used to talk to me before. Now he's talking to me. I think he thinks that, he's seen that I've improved my farm. He now respects me. No, he doesn't. He's just sort of making it look like that. But he doesn't want to go too far with it, so he says it with kind of a smirk on his face, gives you a compliment about your farm as he, rides by on his horse, with kind of a sarcastic grin on his face. And so he rides on and think, he just gave me a compliment, but he was kind of like, would he mean that, or was he being sarcastic? I don't know. And it appears to have been the intent. You want to keep them kind of confused, so they don't hate you, and they don't necessarily like you too much. The art of condescension. Lastly, but not least, the rewards and punishments that were given out from this point forward with regard to slaves were designed to keep poor whites and slaves apart from each other. This was in many ways the biggest fear of the wealthy in Virginia, and that is that poor whites and slaves would make common cause and rally together and fight against, because the poor whites already outnumbered the rich people by a great deal. If they got together with escaped slaves, they'd really outnumber them. So this was was a source of terror for the rich. So from this point forward, there was a lot of attention given to discouraging relations between whites and blacks. So a plantation owner, for instance, just as one example, there are many, might hire a poor white guy to be the manager of his plantation and pay him a lot of money, way more than he's ever made in his life. but let him know, if you don't do your job exactly how I say, which often, of course, meant abusing Native Americans, or I mean African Americans, Native Americans probably as well. But if you don't do your job and abuse people if they're not, working exactly as I say, and if you ever hang out with them, like after the day's work is over and have a beer with them or whatever, uh, you're going to be fired. And if you were the poor white guy, you'd know that if you got fired, you go right back to being a poor white guy. You were getting paid a lot more money than you ever had before. So these are the kind of rewards and sort of threats of punishments or punishments given out intentionally to help keep the races apart. Now, I'm not saying racism was already, of course, around. The Virginia planters did not invent racism, but they certainly perpetuated it and did so, with intent.